last year over the summer, I was in a room with a bunch of manufacturing CEOs. And in this time of so much technological change and challenge and interesting things going on, they spent 4 hours talking about tariffs. And do you have the right broker? And where do I get this? And what about this? And I just thought, what a terrible tax on the human imagination. That's the kind of stuff that's keeping them from raising the next generation of leaders, coming up with new product ideas. And to your point, to your question, getting out with customers and really understanding them. Again, the source of all great knowledge about how to grow your business comes from the people that buy your goods and services. And anything that keeps us away from them is something that we really need to fend off in some way.
Welcome to Franklin Covey's On Leadership. I'm your host, Jennifer Colosimo. On Leadership provides insight to our listeners through discussions with senior leaders and thought leaders focused on the human side of strategy and transformation. Every headline I read and every leader I speak with seem to say the same thing. The world's moving faster, the technology's more complex, and the stakes for every strategic decision feel higher than ever. The question is, as a leader, what can you actually do about it? Joining us today is Dan Bigman. Dan is the editor and chief content officer of Chief Executive Group. He's a veteran journalist who was previously managing director at Forbes and the founding business editor of NewYorkTimes.com. Today, he spends his time at the epicenter of executive leadership, learning how the most influential and successful leaders navigate today's most pressing challenges and most promising opportunities. Dan, welcome to On Leadership. We're so pleased to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jen. I'm really looking forward to it.
So, Dan, you are editor-in-chief and chief content officer of Chief Executive Group. That's a lot of chiefs.
Oh, yeah. That comes up a lot for sure.
That's a lot of chiefs. So could you tell us more for listeners that are unfamiliar, what the Chief Executive Group does, the value you bring to your members, the events, all of the things that you do for the C-suite and board members?
Sure. Our whole purpose as a company is to help give our communities, CFOs, CEOs, board members, a competitive edge. These are the hardest jobs in American business, and people could use a hand. So we've been around since 1977. We publish 2 print magazines, Chief Executive, Corporate Board Member, and we have peer groups for CEOs, for CFOs, for corporate board members, and we run events for all of those groups as well. We also publish a lot of proprietary research. And really the focus of what we're trying to do is to help society by helping the people who run American business. We do think that the folks doing this have an oversized impact on how well the country runs, and it's our privilege to serve them.
Well, thank you. And of course, you've been a key partner with many of Franklin Covey's thought leaders. I had the great opportunity last September to attend the Boardroom Summit and Peer Exchange. And just to give our listeners the headlines of the kinds of guests that you bring and the thought leadership you bring, I was able to listen to Hester Pierce, one of the SEC commissioners who's been dubbed Crypto Mom. She's responsible for the SEC's dedicated crypto task force, was able to see you interview James Patterson and Patrick Ledden on stage around Disrupt Everything. So let's start with the board. With your exposure to so many public board members and policymakers, what are some key things that are on the minds of the board of directors of our companies right now?
We do a ton of research around this. And the big 2 things, geopolitics and geopolitical volatility and how to navigate that and how to make sure that they're, steering the company right. Because remember, the job of the public company director is not to run the company. It's to help govern the company. They have to have a longer time horizon that they're thinking about. They're stewards of capital. That's really what they do. They don't make the decisions about how to run the business. They help backstop the executives. So right now, geopolitics is a huge deal, and artificial intelligence is a huge deal. That's it feels like it's this massive productivity breakthrough. Maybe, possibly, people are experimenting a lot, but how do you govern that? How do you make sure it's safe? How do you make sure that it's doing what you want it to do? And increasingly, how do you make sure that it's not more expensive than the work that you had humans doing to produce it beforehand? This stuff, a lot of people have this idea that this is $20 a month and off you go. At a large company that's using one of the big systems, it can be tens of thousands of dollars very quickly as it burns through tokens and gets involved in more and more systems. So there's a lot of complexity around deploying these things, and it comes against the backdrop of a lot of volatility in other parts of the world. So it's a pretty complex time to be a public company director. And then there's
Well,
activists, and then there's hiring the right CEO, and then there's all the stuff that
yes.
used to be just the plain core of being a public company director.
The plain core in spending time on CEO assessment and succession, governing the financials, that
Yep.
fiduciary accountability. One of the things I've heard in much of your work is board members are going a little deeper. When you think of governance, they're going a little deeper when it comes to AI in terms of what that means. Anything that you would add to that?
I think it's a two front issue for corporate board members. One is, how do you keep yourself personally up to speed and keep yourself relevant so that you're really able to speak lingua franca on AI in the boardroom, being part of those conversations in something that candidly is developing far faster than almost any technology in our lifetimes. I think back to my own time with the birth of the commercial internet back in the 90s, which I was involved with. This feels faster than even that. And public company directors, we run a lot of programs for them right now to try to help them stay on top of everything. But it's a chore. It's a chore to do that on the personal leading. And then it's doing this on behalf of the organization. There are regulatory frameworks that are erupting around the world. There are technology questions. There are safety questions. And so that's the other thing. They have to be able to help their companies make the right decisions. And to do that, they need to be up to speed themselves. So it's a lot. And it comes again against a backdrop of a pretty crazy 10 years where there's been so much change and challenge. So it's a tough job. It's a tough job. They are 100% earning their keep these days.
I think so as well. Well, let's go to the C-suite. Let's go to the C-suite. As I mentioned, you've been a partner with Franklin Covey and many others in the past in bringing thought leadership to your members. You've partnered with Stephen M.R. Covey, the author of Leading at the Speed of Trust and Trust and Inspire. And coming up in June, you have an strategy execution session focused with Chris McChesney. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned from those leaders. I love to hear about your perspective on it versus what we find at Franklin Covey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for me, Trust and Inspire was kind of the book for COVID. I got into that book during COVID, and it just felt right. When we were forced to decentralize as rapidly as we were, the command and control, as we all remember, whether you liked it or not, went away. You simply, when you had a distributed workforce overnight the way that we did for so many companies, manufacturers excluded, of course, they needed a new operating system. And that's when I really, locked in on Trust and Inspire and thought, like, this is really the way to go for managing a modern organization. And recently, a few months ago now, I worked with Stephen on developing that idea, that platform around AI, because I think, again, Stephen's really onto something with Trust and Inspire. If you can't, the core issue with AI is going to be about trust all over the place. It's, will consumers trust it? Can you trust the output? But also inside of our organizations, can the employees trust that their leaders have their best interests at heart as they're deploying the AI? Can the leaders trust that what they're getting from their employees is the best effort towards deploying the AI? Trust is everywhere. So I think that, if you go back and you look at Trust and Inspire, a lot of the really nuts and bolts things in there, and this is a lot of what Stephen and I discussed, it was a big article that we did for the magazine, really has to come about developing those systems of trust and those frameworks, that allow us to really make the most of the technology the incredible technology advances that we're hitting on today. Only by making this something where we can extend everyone's God-given potential rather than essentially put people out of work. Unlocking that magic, which I think Steven's system really will help with. I think that really is the only way for companies to really get the most out of the AI revolution.
Yeah. And I mean, it is difficult, isn't it? I mean, even everywhere I go, leaders that I talk to, their teams are struggling with, I don't really see how this wouldn't eventually take my job. There's so much fear. And some of that extending trust, being transparent, and truly having the intent to unlock potential of people versus, and knowing, of course, some jobs will go away.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, 100%. And look, I think you have to be transparent and we have to be real. And your employees are super smart. Um, not everybody is, not every job, I wouldn't say everybody, not every job is going to be around in 5 years or 10. That was going to be the case whether AI came along or not. You look at the United States back at the time of its founding in 250 years ago, 99% of people worked on farms or around agriculture. There was no discernible service economy. Flip it around, 250 years later, it's the absolute inverse. I think 1%, 2% work in agriculture, and the rest of us work largely in services, less so even in manufacturing than it was at the turn of the century. The one thing about, as our executive chairman, Wayne Cooper, is working on a piece for me now, where he talks about the American operating system. And the American operating system really is, about continuous change, and the fact that we just keep capitalizing on new technologies, and we have to have some faith that if things go in the way they've gone, and I do have this faith, we're going to figure this out and there's going to be more for everyone rather than less. I just think we just have to be careful in how we bring people along and make sure that we're trying to bring people along. This should not be something that's simply about more for fewer. And I think that doesn't unlock the full potential here. AI won't realize its full potential if that's really what the thesis is around how to use it.
Right, right. Well, and there's so much macro. You've alluded to this. There's so much macro if you think socioeconomic, political, geopolitical. When you are working, in the work that you've seen with all these C-suite leaders, what are the things that are under their control? If you were to lead with, here's what you can really influence, what are some of the things you're hearing?
I think this is really key. And this is one thing that, you alluded to. We're going to be doing a program with Chris and Scott around 40X, 4 disciplines. And the reason we called on them to do this was I think they really do have the unlock for this right now. And we had a conversation yesterday, actually. We're talking about in times of volatility, the job of the CEO is clarity, right? You really have to get the organization clear on what will move the needle for the company. And that's really the work you can do. When I talk to a lot of folks, the opportunities that are out there that I see that are under discussed really revolve around the customer. It's how much more can you get in front of your customer? Everything you need to know about we forget this sometimes, everything we need to know about how to prosper, we can learn from our customers, right? And engaging with them more, learning more about their habits, whether that's through getting on a plane and going when other people aren't, through data, through measurement, through all the different ways, having that holistic idea of what the customer really needs, not just wants, but really needs. How can we be useful to people? That really is, I think, what underpins everything. I would say some of the other things that I hear a lot, or I don't hear enough, but I think are really, really essential when it comes to opportunity right now. Pricing, pricing, pricing. It's not just for so many companies, we went into inflation, they hadn't raised prices in a long time. And they got into this kind of scramble where it's like, oh my God, my prices are going up, so I've got to raise my prices. And I tell you, there's a lot of pricing fatigue on behalf of companies. So few companies I know had built a systematic approach to pricing. Really what you need to develop, I think, from working with some really smart people like Simon Kucher, which is a great organization, does a lot on pricing. You really need to develop a pricing culture, a culture where it's not about cost plus. Nobody wants to be in the business where it's cost plus. It's like, my costs went up X, so I will price this along to you at Y. That's not it. It's about what is the unique value proposition that you're furnishing your customers that can't be duplicated somewhere else? And how do I make sure that I'm getting maximum dollar for that? So things like customer segmentation, understanding what customers need what, really getting into the nitty-gritty with that. Because I'll tell you, the most important thing in any company, I think it's been forever true, but it's going to become even more so, is the value of your company is almost completely dependent on your ability to pass along price, right? Your ability, your pricing, call it a moat, call it a drawbridge, call it whatever. Your unique ability to pass across pricing is the value proposition for your company, whether you're selling it, growing it, partnering with others. You've got to be essential to somebody so that they can't withdraw. And you've got to be able to have the pricing leverage there. And I think that's really, that really is, if you were to simplify what the big opportunity is for companies, it's getting refocused around that. What is that unique value proposition? Who can't live without us? And how can we continue to make sure that we're getting paid the way we should for that?
Today's leaders are under a mountain of pressure. They're dealing with everything from disruptive technologies like AI to the reality of keeping teams engaged and delivering world-class results without burning them out. Put simply, leadership is difficult, and there is significant opportunity to those who get it right. We've put together an in-depth view of what leaders are facing today, the actions they can take, and the mindsets they can adopt to lead through today's time of significant challenge and opportunity. In Franklin Covey's Insight Report titled, "Where Are All the Great Leaders?" Grab your free copy from the show notes. Now let's get back to the conversation. From a customer standpoint, it's interesting that you bring this up. Clarity from the CEO, I expected. Customer intimacy, knowledge, having a complete picture of who your customer is and what they desire, maybe less so in terms of what you're hearing from CEOs. Why, if this is so critical, would people get away with it? I mean,
I
they're
think
not focused there.
get away from it because I think it's hard. Like, and Chris talks a lot about this, in 40X, it's the whirlwind. The thing that keeps us from doing the things we want to do is not that we don't want to do them. It's that we're just really, really busy. We're spinning a lot of plates, especially CEOs. One of the worst things I got to witness in the last few years. We run a lot of roundtables for CEOs. We have the Chief Executive Network, which is one of the largest peer networks for CEOs in the country. We get folks together around conference tables at airport hotels, and it's like group therapy. They sit and they talk, and we have facilitators, and they really get into the nitty gritty of their businesses. And last year, over the summer, I was in a room with a bunch of manufacturing CEOs. And in this time of so much technological change and challenge and interesting things going on, they spent 4 hours talking about tariffs. And do you have the right broker? And where do I get this? And what about this? And I just thought, what a terrible tax on the human imagination. That's the kind of stuff that's keeping them from raising the next generation of leaders, coming up with new product ideas. And to your point, to your question, getting out with customers and really understanding them. Again, the source of all great knowledge about how to grow your business comes from the people that buy your goods and services. And anything that keeps us away from them is something that we really need to fend off in some way. And that's, one of the great things I hear from CEOs a lot is when they step up to the job from another position, whether they were the head of marketing or a CFO or a general manager, is they didn't really realize how much calendar challenge how much challenge they were going to have around their calendars, and having how much important calendar discipline is. Really, it's one of the key things that is under focused on, how important it is to maintain the discipline so that you've got those areas squared. You've got the square in your outlook that says, go see Bob about this, or review the customer data, or, make sure that I'm spending enough time at the front line with my frontline employees to hear what they're hearing from customers. A good friend of our firm, Ed Bastian, is the CEO of Delta. When he got the job, you would think he was told straight away, one thing you got to do is get rid of that email, man. Like, you cannot have a public email. If you have a public email, you will do nothing other than respond to a public email. And he decided not to because he wanted that intimacy. And what he says is quite often, if there's a ground halt at an airport, he knows about it via his email before he knows about it via his team. And he likes it that way. We have so many opportunities these days, thanks to technology, to have customer intimacy. I would lean into that wherever possible and make sure that you're enforcing the calendar discipline so that you're not closed off and insulated from your customers.
Critical. I mean, calendar discipline seems to change with each level, right? When you move from individual contributor to having a team to being a leader of leaders. And then by the time you're the CEO, that is a key discipline. A challenge to this, I've heard this from CEOs and also other C-level leaders where they say, well, but think of Apple or Tesla. Sometimes you have to create a market. You have to create demand. The customer doesn't know what's best or what they need. How do you respond to that?
I think that's great. There's only one flaw to that thesis is most of us, I would say all of us pretty much, except for a few notable examples, are not Steve Jobs. And we are not, we're not Elon Musk. And that's okay. We're not all gifted in that way. That doesn't mean that we can't be extremely effective. We don't have our own gifts in whatever ways there. But too often, we have this idea of what the CEO is that's based on these really famous one-off ideas of CEOs. And it's a pity because it distracts the public, it distracts other leaders. There's a lot more to learn from a lot of really good mid-market CEOs that I know than there is from Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a one-off. He's an incredible guy. He's an amazing inventor. He does all the things. I'm not sure I want to work for him anytime soon, or a lot of people do. But he's he's not the model that most of us can follow because we're probably not as smart as he is, right? Steve Jobs, we may not have the orchestrator's imagination that he does, but there's other things that are much more repeatable, systematic, that we can do, because what we're really trying to do is not be the kind of leader that can't be followed by another leader in our organizations, right? That's really not the company that we want to build. We want to build systems, processes, cultures, climates that if we were run over by a bus tomorrow, the company would continue on without us. That's real success, not, oh my God, we have to pay this guy $1 trillion because if he steps away from the company, there is no company. Honestly, if I'm a shareholder, I'd worry a lot about that versus the kind of companies that the most of us really want to and are able to create.
Are able to create a long-term sustainable enterprise and the performance there, which is, one of the things we were talking about was you have upcoming in June, an execution playbook, some content that you're going to work through with Chris McChesney and Scott Thiel from Franklin Covey. That is something you can control. So tell me some of the things that you find most interesting in bringing that to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what I love about 40X, what I love about those guys is they take into account the actuality of how I think most of us our lived experience in business. And they don't say, well, you must stop doing stuff, what they call the whirlwind. Like you can't stop doing the whirlwind. The whirlwind is 80% of your business, right? The trains just must continue to go. But they do offer a path through by saying you really got to focus on what will move the needle in your business. And then they offer a framework for how to move that forward. And what we're going to focus a lot on in that session is figuring out what will move the needle in your business. One of the things I think that was really interesting talking to them yesterday is I had questions for them about how do you use 4 disciplines when it comes to AI? And the simple answer, not to give away too much from what we're going to be talking about the masterclass, but it's the wrong question. It's not about what can I use AI for? It's what are the business imperatives that I have? Instead of having an AI project, it's what are the business imperatives I have, or what could I be? And how can I use this tool to accomplish those things? It may be that the best thing for you to do on the most important business imperative in your company that will really move the needle has nothing to do with AI. It may have to do with something else entirely. But making sure that, you're not putting the cart before the horse. They say, and they're out talking to a lot of people all the time, I see this a lot too. We have a lot of people running around when it comes to AI saying, how do I use AI? And that's the
Right.
mission. And that can't be the mission. If that's the mission, you're just going to spin your wheels. And that's what's happening to a lot of people these days.
Really insightful, really insightful. You have, I think, the 40th anniversary of your CEO awards coming up. Am I right? Is the
That was
40th
that was last year.
last year?
Dave Ricks from Eli Lilly. This is something that's been going on now for 40 years. It's the CEO of the year. I just want to clarify, this is not someone that we name. I think what's different, why that award resonates so much in the CEO community, is it's chosen by a selection committee that's comprised entirely of extremely experienced CEOs and former CEOs. A lot of our former CEOs of the year still serve on that selection committee, and they pick someone every year, and that's why this it's so meaningful to the CEOs who are awarded it. Is it comes from peers, not from editors, not from analysts. It's not like a bunch of editors get in a room and say, who do we like, who would make a good cover. This is, who do the best CEOs in the country think is the best CEO in the country, and it's often not about the stock valuation or just the run up in finances. It's who's faced the big challenge, right? Who's made it through the other side of something really, really cool. And this year, Greg Brown from Motorola Solutions, he is our CEO of the year, and we'll be celebrating him this October in New York.
I love the selection criteria. You mentioned that it isn't always stock valuation or obviously popularity. It comes from CEOs. And so we've talked about job number one being clarity, really focusing on customer intimacy, switching your mindset about AI to what are the key business challenges I have? How will I adapt to them? And then therefore, how does any kind of tech stack, technological suite, AI included, come to help me achieve that? When you think about, I don't know if you're involved in the debates or the CEOs who choose CEO of the year, obviously a great honor. I think we co-sponsored with you, Franklin Covey, last year in part of the sponsorship for that 40th year. What are some of their criteria, meaning big challenge, as they think about this and they're assessing their peers? How are CEOs assessing their peers?
I think, it's a really great question, and everything that goes on inside that room is completely, we've kept it completely confidential. But I can talk a little bit about the framework. This was something that was developed over years with consultancy, Alex Partners, and the CEOs that are on the selection committee. And a lot of it really is about degree of difficulty, right? It's not just riding the tailwind of a great market. The best play in business is to be in a good business, right? There's nothing that beats right now having anything that goes inside of a data center that's running AI, right? You look at the stock valuations of Corning Glass or Caterpillar or many mid-market heating, venting, and air conditioning organizations. Exactly. And they're booming not because, obviously very competent, right? But like they're in a great sector. But quite often what they're looking for is the folks that have revolutionized a sector or have done something extraordinary themselves. I guess the best short end is, who's going to be a great ambassador for the job of CEO? Who's a great leader? So, and they're for different reasons. Some of the folks over the years, we've had everybody from Bill Gates at Microsoft, Andy Grove, and more recently, I refer back to Ed Bastian. This is somebody who took a near bankrupt airline and made it and created an entirely new business model for airlines. You look at somebody like Mark Benioff, obviously the stock, at Salesforce struggling a little bit, but this is somebody who's pulled off one of the most incredible hat tricks in business, which is, as you and I both know, it's one thing to be a CEO at a startup. It's another thing to be a CEO at a mid-cap, at a scale-up. Then you're a mid-cap. Then you're big. Then you're a hyperscaler. And then, so this is somebody who somehow learned how to be the CEO the organization needed over and over and over again, right? So that's another kind of thing. Dave Ricks at Eli Lilly. This is somebody who, they came from behind. They were behind Novo Nordisk when it came to GLP-1 drugs. came up with better science, better execution, and then it just became, he knew exactly what needed to happen. It was a manufacturing horse race. And he just has found a way to scale that company like no drug company in the history of mankind. It really is unbelievable the way he's been able to coalesce a team and execute on a project in a way that nobody's ever seen before in that industry. So those are the kinds of things I really, they're the kinds of people who create entirely new industries. They revolutionize new industries, or they're also just doing something so transformative in a business that you just got to kind of stand up and applaud.
Well, and hopefully align with what we talked about earlier, the trust and inspire leaders that are thinking not just about performance now, but having a long-term sustainable organization that goes through those stages of growth. And whether they're the leader for the future or someone else is the leader is the future. And that's kind of the last question I'd like to leave on. As you think about the future, what is your insight as to, is it the criteria we've covered, or are there additional things that CEOs of the future are going to need to be able to have to be successful, say in 5, 10 years?
Absolutely. It's a good question, and one that I was curious about. So I asked last year when we did the CEO of the Year issue, I asked a bunch of really competent CEOs who had been on the selection committee for a long time, what is the CEO of the future? What is the leader of the future going to need to be about? And the number one thing that they said to a person was the ability to learn, right? That ability to learn faster than the change, to keep them, you cannot become the bottleneck to the changes that are going on. You'll need to acclimate, learn, process, help your team learn faster than the changes around you if you're going to want to keep the company growing. That's going to be the key and most fundamental skill. Curiosity, right? The ability to adapt, the ability to, remain flexible intellectually, because things may look one way one day and then boom, suddenly they're very different. That's been the experience of the last, 10 years now. It's getting faster and faster. I think we can only expect it to go faster and faster. And I will say that I did love what we ended on in that article. Bob Nardelli, who had run, Home Depot and Chrysler and one of the best operators America ever produced when he was working at GE, he said, you also got to really, really like it, right? You got to like it. These are hard jobs. Running a company, I don't care what size it is, through all of the crazy stuff that's been going on and keeping up with the backlog and making payroll and all that stuff, you got to really just get juiced by it and get energy out of it and not find it draining. And, as long as you get a kick out of it, it's probably a good job, and probably not for a whole, once you don't, probably not a good time to stick around.
The last thing you need, whether it's CEO or another C-level leader, is a disengaged C-level leader.
Yeah.
Or really, it would be great if none of the leaders were completely disengaged. But I do want to emphasize one thing that you said that was really critical. You tend to, at least I've experienced with many leaders, you grow in your career and think, oh, I get this. And having that at least 10, 20% of your mind that says, I don't know everything about anything and I'm curious. And just because it looks like this now doesn't mean, and having the flexibility, I don't think that's a natural skill set or something that we've cultivated in leadership necessarily as strongly in the past.
I think you're 100% right. And, one of the big devotees around this is Mark Benioff. He's very, very into meditation, into Buddhism, and he speaks a lot about beginner's mind. And that's the ability, and it's a discipline, and it takes a lot of effort, very prescriptive. You've got to be on it, about being able to come to new situations with an open mind, right? And he cultivates, he has a meditation practice. It's something that I think is very tough for all of us. As you say, you come along, you're great at marketing, so you get to the CEO level and you see everything through the marketing prism, and we tend to have a lot of internal inertia. Our ability that we cultivate to fight that internal inertia is so critical, and going to be even more critical as the world starts moving faster and faster.
Curiosity, not being a bottleneck, and learn. Be willing to learn. And as we talked about calendars in the previous part of our conversation, putting time in your calendar to learn. It's not by osmosis.
A great example of this is Dave Ricks at Eli Lilly. He has the coolest program for this. Every single quarter, he has a list of things. He has a couple key things that he really wants to spend time on. It could be a deal, but it could also be a new science. It could be just something he really wants to spend time on. He then goes to his board and he says, these are the things that I want to spend prescriptive time on. How does that align with what you think? They have a discussion. Then he has his assistant book it into his calendar so that he's going to take that time is sacred and he's going to focus on it. So you ask, like, wow, that sounds great, Dave. How'd you do? Because none of us are doing that, right? If it makes you feel any better, I think what he told me was that after he goes back and audits it every single quarter afterwards. He has his assistant audit how much time on target he actually had. I think he said the best he's ever done is 60%, despite all his best efforts. So the whirlwind is real. We have to guard against the whirlwind, whether it's for the company and the company's big goals or our own personal goals, customers, growth, learning. We really have to be protective to make sure that we're working on ourselves and not just getting swept up in things.
Swept up in the system. Well, let's leave our listeners with that, regardless of your level in the organization. Blocking off time, and 60%, by the way, is better than none with all of that effort. Learning, being curiosity. Thank you so much for joining us, Dan. It was a wonderful conversation, and look forward to seeing you at future chief executive events.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me on.